Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to my channel. Today, inshallah, we will have chapter 1 from the story A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens for grade 9 or prep 3. Chapter 1's title is The Mysterious Message. This is a summary of the chapter. We will read the summary, then we will have questions and answers. The same poor conditions in the two cities. Here, when we talk about the cities, we mean the city of London and Paris at the time. It was the year 1778, 75, and conditions in both France and England were very bad. King George III of England was too busy handling his country's problems with the American colonies to worry about his own people who lived in poverty. King Louis XV of France and the noblemen were more concerned with their pleasure and wealth to worry about the poor, hungry lower classes. The poor people of France had begun to make plans to overthrow their rulers. So it was that London and Paris, the capitals of the two countries, were on the brink of revolution. So the bad conditions of people, that they were living in poverty, and the rulers of France and England were not caring about their people, but they were caring about their pleasures, about their colonies, and left their people in poverty and in bad conditions. Thus, the story starts with the Dover Mail. There was much crime in England during this period. Why? Because the conditions are not stable. Thus, the passengers traveling out of London on late night in November feared for their safety when they heard a horse coming from behind. The rider had a message for one of the passengers heading for Dover, Mr. Lorry from Tellson's Bank in London. Mr. Lorry is the sincere friend of Dr. Menet, the main character in the story. The message said, what did the message say? It said, wait at Dover for Mademoiselle Mr. Lorry. Who was that Mademoiselle? It was, or she was, the daughter of Dr. Menet, Miss Lucy. Okay. Wait at Dover for Mademoiselle Mr. Lorry answered, Jerry, you can't say that my answer is recalled to life. And this is a symbol for Dr. Menet when he was released from the prison, and it seemed that he, as if he was recalled to life. Mr. Lorry then began to doze. Doze, he means to have to go asleep. Okay, he went to sleep. Okay, but his sleep was not restful, for his dreams were filled with scenes of him digging a man out of grave. We notice here that Charles Dickens used symbols in his story. Here, this is one of the symbolism that is used in that story. Mr. Lorry, when he began to sleep, he had a dream. Okay, what was his dream? His dream was that filled with scenes of him digging a man out of grave. Over and over, Mr. Lorry asked the ghost, how long have you been buried? Almost 18 years, was the ghost's repeated reply. That's the symbol of Dr. Menet. After he had spent 18 years in prison, the writer or the writer of the story, Charles Dickens, okay, described him as if someone got out from the grave with his coffin uh, after he had been buried for 18 years old. That means that he came back to life after 18 years he had spent in prison. Was the ghost's repeated reply. By mid-morning, the mail coach arrived in Dover, the departure point for boats crossing the English Channel to Calais, France. Mr. Lorry arranged for a room at the Royal College at a Royal George Inn. Then he asked for another room to be prepared for a young lady. The young lady, she will be Lucy Menet. Recalled to life. Miss Menet, that's the daughter of Dr. Menet, arrived from London. She was very anxious to see the gentleman from Tellson's Bank at once. Miss Manet was, this is the description of Miss Manet. Miss Manet was a young lady for not more than 17, dressed in a riding coat with her hat in hand. She was short, slim, pretty girl with long golden hair and deep blue eyes. The look of the girl made Mr. Lorry remember her as a child when he held her in his arms during a passage from France to England 15 years before. But Lucy Manet did not recognize him at first. The young lady told Mr. Lorry that she received a letter from Tellson's Bank informing her about a discovery regarding some property of her father, who had been dead for so long. We know that, or we noticed that Miss Manet didn't know that her father is still alive. And they tricked her to bring her back from England to France. They sent her a message or a letter that she had some properties that belonged to her father and she had to come to France to collect or take her father's possessions or properties. Okay, that's the trick that they have invented to let her come from England to France. Okay, the property was in France. The letter said that she must go to Paris to meet a gentleman from the bank. She replied to the bank asking to be put during that journey under the protection of that gentleman. The gentleman had already left London, so a message was sent after him to wait for her at Dover. Dover, it's a port. Yes. Mr. Lorry told her that he was the man from Tellson's Bank. Then he told her the story of a French customer of the bank. He meant her father. He was a doctor of great talents who was married to an English lady about 20 years ago. Mr. Lorry was a friend of that man and served him in the bank. One day, that doctor had suddenly disappeared. His wife feared that he might have been sent to prison by a powerful enemy who could sign some papers to imprison any person for as long as the enemy wished. Now Mr. Lorry is telling Miss Manet about the story of her father. The mother begged the people in authority to know anything about her husband, but failed. She decided at last to raise the child to believe that her father was dead. So Lucy Manet was brought up and she had the thought that her father is dead. He didn't know that her father was imprisoned by a powerful enemy. The mother then died broken-hearted when the child was only 2 years old. Then the child had been moved to England by Mr. Lorry. Mr. Lorry, the sincere friend of Dr. Manet, took the girl and he gave her to Miss Ross that she will take care of her, but she will live in London, not in Paris. The father had been found alive, but changed so much that no one would recognize him. He had been freed from the Bastille prison and taken to the house of his old faithful servant in Paris. Mr. Lorry told her that they were going there, Mr. Lorry to identify him, and Lucy to comfort him and restore him to health. By an illegal way, the revolutionaries managed to release Dr. Menet from the prison, and that was at that time very, very difficult because the people who put him in prison are still in power, are still ruling France. So if they knew that he was released, they may take him back to the prison, and they may take the people who released him to prison also. So this issue was done secretly. Mr. Lorry also warned her that her father had been found under another name, and that the people who had put her father in prison still rule the country, so they mustn't speak of that matter or carry papers referring to him. Okay, he warned her that you mustn't talk to anyone about that issue. Don't tell anyone that we found your father alive, okay, because this would be very dangerous for him and for the people who helped him to get out of prison. This they simply use the code words recalled to life. So they used a code name for him recalled to life to refer to Alexander Manet's release from prison. The young lady, trembling violently, said, I'm going to see his ghost. It will be his ghost, not him. Then she fainted because she was afraid. She was very anxious to see her father. But when he told her that he will be in a very bad condition, he might be in very bad condition, and he will not be able at first to recognize her. Okay, she said that I will see his ghost. It will be his ghost, and then fainted. Let's look at the reaction of Miss Bross. Okay, a wild-looking woman with red hair rushed in and grabbed Mr. Lorry's jacket. She lifted him from his chair and sent him flying across the room. She was so angry with him for frightening Lucy to death. She was Miss Pross, who had taken care of Lucy since her childhood. Okay, the Dover Mail, it is a mail coach that carried letters from London to Dover and the vice versa. The Dover Mail took letters and passengers to the Dover port where they crossed the English Channel to Calais, the port on the opposite side in France. Okay, now let's see questions and answers. Okay, so we have read a very important summary and good summary about the chapter one. Now we will see questions and answer. Question number one: speak about the gap between the high and the low classes in the two countries. This is a very important questions because it gives us information about the differences and the gap between the rich people and poor people of France and England at that time. They were huge, there were huge differences and gaps between people at that time. The noble were living in comfort and luxury, whereas the peasants and common people were living in poverty and misery. The noble were living in comfort and luxury, where the peasants and common people were living in poverty and misery. Yes. Question number two: why were the poor in very bad conditions in France and England? As I told you before, while we were reading the summary that the King of England was too busy with problems with the American colonies to worry about his own people who lived in poverty. The King of France also and his noblemen were more concerned with their pleasure and wealth to worry about the poor, hungry lower classes. So the ruler were in a field and the people were in another field. The ruler or the king and his knights and his nobles were living a very comfortable life. They were caring for colonies and they were caring for their pleasure, they were caring for their wealth to worry about the poor, hungry, lower classes. They don't care about their people. And these were the reasons that led to the revolution in France. Why did the passengers fear for their safety when they heard a horse coming behind them? Yes, because there was much crime in England during this period, and roads were unsafe and full of thieves. Because here we can add that the conditions and in that at that time in both England and France were not stable. Okay, what did the rider want? The rider wanted to speak to one of the passengers, a man called Mr. Lorry. He had a message for him. What was the message that the rider carried? What was the reply? The rider carried a message to Mr. Lorry to wait at Dover for Miss Manet. So the message had a very clear order for Mr. Lorry to wait at Dover, okay, to collect Miss Manet. Mr. Manet, Miss Manet, he will accompany her to take her father. Mr. Lorry's reply was recalled to life. And this was a simple symbol for or signifies Mr. Menet or Dr. Menet. Why didn't Lucy's mother want her to know that her father could be alive? As we know that Lucy Menet was brought up with the thought that her father is dead, that her father is dead, not alive. Okay, but so it was a very big surprise. It was a very big shock for her to discover when she was 17 or 18 years old, when she discovers that her father is still alive. And he had spent all this period in prison for things that he didn't do. He was oppressed. He didn't do nothing to be sent to prison. Lucy's mother didn't want her to know that her father could be still alive because she spent 2 years looking for him but couldn't find out whether he was still alive or dead. She wanted her daughter to grow up happily without doubts and worries. Again, she wanted her daughter to grow up happily without doubts and worries. Recall to life comment. This is a very important question, and it is repeated in so many previous exams. So take care of that question, please. Recall to life comment. That was Mr. Lorry's reply to the bank's message. It meant that Dr. Manet, who was believed to be dead for so long, was found alive. He would be recalled to life by the help of Mr. Lorry and Lucy Manet. He would be recalled to life. That means that they will help him to recover. They will help him to regain his health and his mind. Waited over for Mademoiselle Comment. As you know that we have two types of questions, WH questions and quotation with, and you have to comment on this quotation. This was the message that the horse rider carried for Mr. Lorry. The message asked Mr. Lorry to wait at Dover for Miss Manet to accompany her to Paris as she was afraid to travel alone. Why was Mr. Lorry not restful in his sleep? Because his dreams were filled with scenes of him digging a man out of grave. And as I told you, this was a symbol of Dr. Menet after he was released from prison after 18 years he had spent in prison for things that he didn't do. He didn't do any thing wrong to be sent to prison for 18 years. Yes, I'm going to see his ghost. It will be his ghost, not him. Comment. Of course, this was said by Lucy Menet. Lucy Menet said this to Mr. Lorry. She had been told that her father, whom she had thought did all her life, was still alive. He had been in prison for 18 years and was now free. Okay, Mr. Lorry had warned her that he was greatly changed and lost his mind. Okay, so when he warned her that she will see the remains of a man, she will see a man who was distracted by the whole period that he had spent in prison. He said that he warned her that he was greatly changed and lost and almostly lost his mind. Jury, you can say that my answer is recall to life. Who said this to whom? Mr. Lorry said this to the horse rider. Who is meant by recall to life? Dr. Manet. What did the words recall to life mean? Mr. Lorry wanted to assure the bank that his mission to restore Dr. Manet to London was going to be fulfilled successfully. What strange dream did Mr. Lorry have? What did it mean? Yes. In his sleep, Mr. Lorry dreamed that he was digging a man out of a grave and asking him now how long he had been buried. The man answered that he was buried for almost 18 years. This was a reflection of Mr. Lorry's mission of recalling Dr. Manet to life after his long imprisonment. Describe Dr. Miss Manet. This is the description of Lucy Manet. She was a young lady of not more than 17. She was short, slim, pretty girl with long golden hair and deep blue eyes. What secret did Mr. Lorry finally reveal to Mr. Manet? Of course, the secret about her father and he is still alive, and the fact that he is dead is not true. Mr. Lorry told her that her father wasn't dead, as she had always believed. He had been found alive in Paris. He had been imprisoned in France, in a France prison, and that prison was the famous prison in France, the Bastille, a French prison for the past 18 years, and that she would accompany him to Paris in a secret mission to bring her father back to London. It's a story you know because it was you who brought me to England when my mother died, just 2 years after my father's death. Comment. Here, Lucy Manet began to remember Mr. Lorry when she was about 2 or 3 years old, and he took her from France to live in London. Lucy Mary said this to Mr. Lorry when she realized it from his story that he was talking about her dead father. She remembered she had seen Mr. Lorry before. He was the person who carried her from Paris to London 15 years ago after her mother's death. The story Lucy Manet knew about her father was different from the story Mr. Lorry. explain. Here we will see that the story that Miss Lucy believed about her father was not true. Her father is still alive, and he had been imprisoned for 18 years old by a very powerful enemy, and that enemy was still ruling in France. So it was a secret mission to release him from prison. Lucy believed the answer for that question. Lucy believed that her father had died before she was even born, but he had been sent away to prison by a powerful enemy who could sign some papers imprisoning him for as long as the enemy wished. Okay. The last question. Why couldn't you tell her what you had to without frightening her to death? Comment. Why couldn't you tell her what you had to without frightening her to death? Comment. These words were said by Miss Pross when she notes that Lucy Manet fainted. Miss Pross, the answer, Miss Pross, the woman who had taken care of Lucy since childhood, said this to Mr. Lorry. Miss Pross attacked Mr. Lorry violently and shouted those words at him when Lucy had fainted after knowing the truth from him. These are some extra questions. I want you to read them carefully and try to find answer for them. Why did Tellson's bank send a messenger after Jervis Lorry? Of course, to tell him about his mission. When had Miss Manet been taken to England? Who took her there? She was taken to England about 15 years ago, and of course, Mr. Lorry took her. Why were Mr. Lorry and Lucy Manet going to Paris? To accompany or to take her father and accompany him to London to recover, to, to take care of him. What had happened to Dr. Manet 15 years earlier? He was imprisoned by a powerful enemy. What surprising news did Mr. Lorry tell Lucy her father is still alive? What was Lucy's reaction to the news? Of course, she fainted. Why were the passengers worried that night? Because there was much crime at that time. What mission were Lucy and Mr. Lorry on? They were going to collect or to accompany Mr. Dr. Manet after he had spent 18 years in prison. Why was Dr. Manet sent to prison? He was sent to prison by a powerful enemy that he signed some papers and he spent as long as 18 years in the prison. He spent 18 years in the prison. Your father has been found, Alexander Manet is alive, but he has changed so much that no one would recognize him. These words were said by Mr. Lorry to Lucy Manet, so as to give her some introduction about the mission that they were going to do, that they were going to accompany her father, and he warned her that he has changed a lot and he almostly lost his mind. These were the extra questions. I want you to keep and study these questions carefully with the answers, and I wish you have understood and got the idea of chapter one. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching. Till we meet again in chapter two, Mr. Mahmoud was with you from Al Andalus Private Schools, the Egyptian section. Thank you.